There is a place where silence speaks louder than words. A place where broken men sit, not because they are lost, but because they are still hoping to be found. At the edge of a quiet countryside church stands a wooden bench, weathered by time, touched by rain, and remembered by God. On that bench, every Sunday, sits one man. He never enters the church. He never joins the choir. He never speaks to anyone. He just sits and stares at the stained glass windows, like he's waiting for something he can't explain, or someone he believes he doesn't deserve. His name is Harold Whitman, and this is his story. Harold Whitman is 72 years old, a retired postal worker, a widower, a man whose hands still remember hard work, but whose heart stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. Every Sunday morning, he walks slowly down the gravel path leading to Willow Creek Chapel. Same routine, same silence, same bench. People in the church notice him, but no one interrupts him, because somehow they all understand. He doesn't sit there out of habit. He sits there like a man standing outside a door he is afraid to open. Inside that church is warmth, music, faith, community. But Harold? Harold stays outside. And every Sunday he whispers the same words. I told you I was done, but I still come here anyway. We don't always leave God with noise. Sometimes we leave him with silence. One Sunday morning, the church bell rings. A deep, echoing sound that fills the valley. And something inside Harold shifts. Because sound has a way of opening locked doors in the heart. Suddenly, he is no longer sitting on the bench. He is back. 30 years earlier. A younger Harold. A louder world. A house filled with grief. A wife crying in the kitchen. And a small boy named Daniel laughing in the hallway. Daniel Whitman. His son. His pride. His joy. And the child he buried too soon. Pause. Soft music shift. The accident came without warning. A wet road. A late evening. A phone call that changed everything. And in one moment, Harold's world ended. Not just his son's life, but his faith. Because he asked the question many silent hearts still ask. Where were you, God? And when heaven didn't answer quickly enough, Harold walked away. Not from a building, but from belief. And he never returned. Until Willow Creek. After the service, Harold remains on the bench. The wind is gentle. The church doors open. People come and go. And then, she appears. Evelyn Carter. 70 years old. Soft-spoken. Graceful. A church pianist whose fingers still carry melodies older than pain. She doesn't startle him. She doesn't force conversation. She simply sits, quietly, on the other side of the bench. And places something beside him. A folded hymn sheet. Harold looks at it but doesn't touch it. After a long silence, he asks, "Why do you keep doing that?" Evelyn smiles faintly. Because some hearts remember music, even when they forget the song. Harold looks away. He doesn't trust comfort. Not anymore. The next Sunday, Harold finally speaks to the pastor. Pastor James. A man in his 60s with kind eyes that seem to understand pain without asking for its history. Harold asks, "Why does she sit near me every week?" Pastor James smiles gently. "Because she always has." Harold frowns. "And why does no one ask me to go inside?" The pastor looks at him for a long moment, then says something unexpected. "Because this bench has a name." Harold's eyes narrow. "A name?" The pastor nods. "We call it the prayer bench." Harold shifts uncomfortably. The pastor continues. "For 30 years, someone has prayed for the man who sits outside instead of coming in." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that presses on the chest. Harold's voice breaks slightly. "Why would anyone pray for me?" Pastor James answers softly. "Because God never stopped waiting." That afternoon, Evelyn finally speaks again. But this time, differently. More personal. More fragile. She sits beside Harold and says, "Do you remember Daniel's Sunday school teacher?" Harold nods slowly. "That was me." Everything stops. Even the wind seems to pause. Evelyn continues. "He was one of the brightest children I ever taught. Harold whispers. He was everything I had. Evelyn nods. Then adds something that changes everything. Before his accident, Daniel wrote something in his little notebook. Harold looks at her. Frozen. Evelyn reaches into her bag, hands trembling slightly. And she reads, "If anything ever happens to me, tell my dad God still loves him." Harold breaks. Not quietly, not politely, but completely. Years of buried grief collapse in a single moment. And for the first time in decades, he cries like a father. The following Sunday is different. Harold arrives earlier than usual. But this time, he doesn't stop at the bench. He walks past it, past the memories, past the fear, past the silence. And he reaches the church door. He hesitates. His hand trembles on the handle. Inside, he hears singing. Soft, warm, alive. And something inside him whispers, "You're still allowed to come home." He opens the door. Slowly, carefully, like a man afraid hope might break if he holds it too tightly. He steps inside. And for the first time in 30 years, Harold Whitman sits inside a church again. During worship, something breaks inside him. Not in destruction, but in release. The music rises. The voices join. And Harold, the man who once walked away, begins to cry again. But this time, it is different. He is not crying from loss. He is crying from return, from recognition, from grace. And in a whisper only heaven seems to hear, he says, "I'm still here, if you'll still have me." Weeks pass. Then months. Harold no longer sits outside. He sits inside now. Front row. Evelyn plays piano. Pastor James smiles more often when he sees him. And the bench outside? Still there. Still weathered. Still waiting. But no longer lonely. Because Harold understands now. It was never the bench that held him. It was God. Final narration. There are people who think they are too far gone. Too broken. Too late. But Willow Creek teaches something different. It teaches that grace does not expire. And love does not forget. And God never stops waiting. Because sometimes, the longest journey home is the one that starts on a wooden bench. There are moments in life when a single piece of paper can collapse everything you thought you understood. A truth you buried. A memory you avoided. A name you stopped speaking. For Harold Whitman, that moment came on a Tuesday morning, when the church secretary handed him an envelope that had been sitting in storage for over 30 years. No return address. No stamp. Just his name, written in a child's handwriting. Inside that envelope was a letter from his son, Daniel. And it was never meant to be found this late. Harold stands outside Willow Creek Chapel. The same bench. The same silence. But today, something is different. His hands are shaking. The envelope feels heavier than paper should feel. Evelyn stands nearby but says nothing. She already knows. Some pain does not need witnesses. Harold opens it slowly, carefully, like opening it too fast might bring the past rushing out. Inside, a folded sheet, faded ink, a child's handwriting. He begins to read, and the world around him disappears. "Dear Dad." Harold closes his eyes. His breath breaks. The wind fades. Only the words remain. "I heard you and Mom fighting again. I don't like when you both are sad. I asked my teacher if God gets sad too. She said maybe he does when families forget how to talk." Harold swallows hard. "Dad, I don't understand everything, but I think God is still with us even when we are angry. If I ever go away somewhere you can't see me, please don't stop talking to him." Harold drops to the bench. His hands cover his face, because the next line is the one that destroys him. "I love you, Dad, even when you don't smile anymore." Evelyn finally speaks. Softly, carefully. "He wrote that 2 days before the accident." Harold whispers, "Why didn't I ever see this?" Evelyn answers, "Because sometimes grief makes us blind to love that is still trying to reach us." Harold looks at the letter again, this time trembling, not with sadness alone, but with guilt. Deep guilt. The kind that sits quietly for decades. He whispers, "He was trying to save me, not the other way around." Harold walks away from the bench. For the first time in years. Not toward home, but toward the empty church. He stands at the door and speaks into the silence. Why would you let me miss this for so long? No answer. Only wind. Only memory. Only silence. And then Pastor James appears behind him. Not rushing. Not interrupting. Just present. He says, sometimes God doesn't remove the pain. He waits until we're strong enough to understand it. Harold shakes his head. I am not strong. Pastor James replies. No, but you are still here. And that is enough. That night, Harold sits alone in his house. The letter on the table. The lights dim. The silence heavy. Then the phone rings. Unknown number. He answers. A woman's voice. Old. Trembling. Familiar. Harold, it's time you know the rest of the story about Daniel's accident. There are truths in life that don't arrive when we are ready for them. They arrive when we are finally able to survive them. Harold Whitman thought he had already suffered the worst thing a man could suffer. He was wrong. Because the phone call that night was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of the truth he was never told. Harold sits frozen. The voice on the phone repeats. It's about Daniel. His hands tighten. His breath shortens. The woman introduces herself. A former hospital nurse. Retired. Now living in a care home near the coast. She says, I've been waiting years to speak to you. Harold whispers. Why? And she answers, because what you believe about that night is not what happened. The woman explains slowly, carefully, like she has carried this truth too long. Daniel was not alone. That night, there was another driver. A second car. A drunk driver who ran the intersection. She pauses, then says, Daniel's last words were not fear. Harold leans forward. They were prayer. He kept repeating, God, protect my dad. Don't let him lose his way. Harold drops the phone. It hits the floor. But he doesn't notice. Because everything inside him is collapsing. Not from guilt anymore, but from realization. Pastor James arrives the next morning. He finds Harold sitting in silence. Not broken anymore, but changed. Harold says, I thought I was abandoned. Pastor James replies, No, you are being carried through what you couldn't understand yet. Harold looks at the church, then the bench, then the sky, and whispers, So all this time, I wasn't alone. Pastor James shakes his head. You never were. Sunday morning, the church is full. But something is different. Harold walks inside without hesitation. Evelyn is already playing piano. She looks at him and smiles. No words needed. Harold stands, slowly, at the front, and speaks, not loudly, but clearly. For 30 years, I thought I lost my son, but I see now. I was never left. Silence in the room. Not awkward silence. Sacred silence. Harold places Daniel's letter on the altar and says, If I could speak to him now, I would tell him. I finally heard him. He sits down, tears falling quietly, not from pain anymore, but from peace. There are some stories that don't end with answers. They end with understanding. And sometimes, understanding looks like grace arriving late, but never too late. Because at Willow Creek, even silence has a voice, and even loss can still become love again.